The air in the underground chamber tasted of myrrh and copper. Incense smoke coiled through lamplight, casting shadows that moved like living things across walls, carved with images of gods coupling, dying, transforming. The chanting had stopped. In that sudden silence, you could hear breathing ragged, uncertain, the kind of breathing that comes from fear mixed with something else. Something the witnesses would never speak about openly, not even to each other in the years that followed. At the center of the ritual space stood Cleopatra, not dressed as a queen, dressed as Isis herself, in pleated linen so fine it was nearly transparent. Her skin painted with gold dust that caught the lamplight and made her seem to glow from within. Around her neck hung the tight amulet, the knot of Isis, symbol of the goddess's power over life and death, over pleasure and pain, over the boundaries between human and divine. In her hands, she held a ceremonial system, the sacred rattle whose sound was said to drive away evil spirits and invoke the goddess's presence. But she was not shaking it. She was watching, waiting. Before her knelt three men, two Egyptian priests who had served the temple of Isis for decades, one Greek physician whose hands trembled as he tried to write observations on papyrus, the stylus slipping in his sweating fingers, and on the stone altar between them lay something that made this more than ritual, more than theater, more than religious ceremony. What happened next would be described in fragments, in whispers, in texts that Roman authorities would later hunt down and burn, because acknowledging it would require admitting something they could not accept. That Cleopatra had discovered something about the intersection of pleasure, power, and submission that made conventional political authority seem crude by comparison. The Romans who wrote about Cleopatra after her death called her a temptress, a seductress, a witch who enslaved men through Eastern sorcery and unnatural appetites. They used words like corruption and depravity and decadence, painting her as the ultimate symbol of everything dangerous about female sexuality and foreign power. But that propaganda, deliberate and systematic, obscured something more disturbing. Cleopatra was not corrupted by desire. She studied it. She experimented with it. She turned her court into a laboratory where human responses to pleasure and pain and fear could be observed, recorded, and weaponized with the same precision she brought to her toxicology experiments and her cosmetic formulations. Some of what she learned survived in fragments that the Romans tried to destroy. Sealed scrolls discovered centuries later in temple archives. Letters between physicians debating whether certain observations should be recorded. Accounts from Egyptian sources that contradict Roman propaganda so completely they must be describing different people or different truths. And in those fragments, in the spaces between what was officially recorded and what was whispered about privately, emerges a portrait of a woman whose understanding of human nature went far beyond anything most rulers of her time or ours would dare to explore. This is not the story of a beautiful queen who seduced powerful men. This is the story of a brilliant, ruthless woman who understood that physical desire creates vulnerabilities that can be manipulated, that witnessing transgression binds people through shared secrets, that merging religious ritual with intimate acts produces psychological effects that transcend both. This is the story of practices that went so far beyond acceptable boundaries that even sources hostile to Cleopatra struggled to describe them directly, resorting to euphemism and implication because explicit description seemed impossible. Tonight you will learn what happened in those underground chambers, what the ritual with the three witnesses actually involved, why the physicians who saw it refused to record their observations in full. What Cleopatra discovered about human responses to experiences that blur boundaries between pleasure and pain, between religious ecstasy and physical sensation, between voluntary submission and psychological coercion. You will learn about experiments conducted on human subjects, about cosmetics tested on slaves who had no choice, about poisons refined through systematic killing of condemned criminals. You will learn about the night she demanded a living offering to prove a man's devotion, about practices that frightened even her own priests, about research her physicians could not bring themselves to document completely. But before I reveal what happened in that chamber beneath the palace, before I tell you about the ritual that left those three witnesses bound by shared knowledge they could never fully articulate, before I explain what Cleopatra learned about the mechanics of desire and domination, I need to take you back. I need to show you how a girl born into a dynasty known for incest and fratricide became the most controversial ruler in ancient history. How she transformed herself into a living goddess whose performances blurred lines between politics and theater, between religion and manipulation, between science and cruelty. If you want to understand how intelligence and power can combine with absolute lack of restraint to create something both fascinating and monstrous, how desire can be studied and weaponized with scientific precision, how history judges women differently than men for the same behaviors, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to learn exists in the gaps between official history and suppressed truth in the fragments Rome tried to burn. In the whispers that survived 2,000 years because they were too disturbing to forget. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you think you know about Cleopatra, because I guarantee this story will shatter every assumption. And watch all the way to the end, because I am going to tell you how Cleopatra died, how her final performance turned defeat into a kind of victory, how she maintained control even as everything collapsed around her. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the world that created the woman who would become history's most dangerous queen. Cleopatra, 7th Philip, was born in 69 years before the birth of Christ into the Tmic dynasty, a Greek ruling family that had controlled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries through a combination of strategic marriages, casual murders, and pragmatic alliances with whoever held power in Rome. Her father was Ptolemy XII, Olytes, the flute player, a king so weak he maintained his throne primarily by bribing Roman politicians and fleeing Alexandria whenever his subjects rebelled against his crushing taxation. Her mother's identity remains disputed, either Cleopatra v. Tryphena or possibly a concubine of lower status whose name was not considered worth recording. The Tmic court, where Cleopatra grew up, was simultaneously one of the most intellectually sophisticated and most morally corrupt environments in the ancient world. The palace overlooked a harbor filled with ships bringing grain and gold and slaves from across the known world. Nearby stood the Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge humanity had ever assembled. Containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls on every subject from mathematics to medicine, from astronomy to alchemy, the Thames patronized scholars, mathematicians, physicians, poets, and philosophers, making Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. But the dynasty maintained its power through practices that would have shocked even other royal families accustomed to brutal politics. Brothers married sisters to concentrate power and wealth. Children murdered parents when inheritance seemed too distant. Siblings plotted against each other with poison and hired assassins and falsified wills. Multiple Ptolemaic rulers were overthrown, exiled, or assassinated by their own relatives. The family's history was written in blood spilled within palace walls, in bodies dumped in the harbor, in heirs who disappeared conveniently when they threatened the wrong person. Cleopatra absorbed lessons from this environment that would shape her entire approach to power. First, blood relationships meant nothing. Her own siblings would become her greatest threats, requiring elimination rather than trust. Second, wealth without military force was vulnerability. Egypt produced gold and grain that made the Thames fabulously rich, but that wealth made them targets for Roman generals who commanded legions. Third, survival meant making yourself indispensable to whoever held power in Rome. The Thames existed at Roman sufferance, paying tribute and bribes to avoid the fate of other Hellenistic kingdoms that Rome had simply conquered and absorbed. But Cleopatra also received an education that was extraordinary, even by the standards of the Tmic court. She was intellectually gifted in ways that went far beyond conventional royal training. She learned to read and write in at least 8 languages, including Greek, Latin, Egyptian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Syriac, Median, and Parthian. This linguistic ability was not decorative. It allowed her to communicate directly with subjects and allies without translators who might distort messages or leak confidential information. It demonstrated a mind capable of mastering complex grammatical systems and cultural contexts, skills that required both intelligence and discipline. She studied mathematics with scholars who had access to Euclid's works and could explain geometric proofs. She learned astronomy from priests who observed stars and planets, tracking their movements to predict eclipses and celestial events that carried religious and political significance. She studied medicine with physicians who practiced both Greek rational medicine and Egyptian temple healing, learning about anatomy, disease, herbal remedies, and the properties of substances ranging from simple painkillers to deadly poisons. She read philosophy, debating ideas with scholars trained in multiple competing traditions, developing rhetorical skills that would later allow her to argue persuasively on any topic. Most crucially for her future practices, she studied chemistry and alchemy. These subjects were not clearly distinguished in the ancient world. What we would call chemistry, the study of how substances interact and transform, was practiced alongside what we would call alchemy, the mystical pursuit of transmutation and perfection. Cleopatra learned about reactions between different materials, about how heating and mixing and dissolving could create new substances with different properties. She learned to distill perfumes from flowers and resins. She learned to extract dyes from mollusks and minerals. She learned to identify poisons from plants and animals and rocks, to understand their effects, to recognize their symptoms. This last subject became a particular fascination. Cleopatra began collecting information about toxic substances systematically, reading everything in the library's vast collection, consulting with Egyptian priests who preserved ancient formulas, corresponding with scholars from other regions who had access to different plants and minerals. She was creating what would become a comprehensive treatise on toxicology, recording symptoms and effective doses and antidotes for hundreds of substances. This research was not merely academic. Poisoning was one of the primary threats facing any ruler in the ancient world, and understanding poisons meant understanding how to protect yourself from them. But knowledge about poisons also meant knowledge about cosmetics. Because many ancient cosmetic ingredients were toxic in high concentrations but beneficial in lower doses. The kohl that Egyptian women used as eyeliner contained lead compounds that could poison if absorbed through skin in sufficient quantities. The white face paint that aristocratic women prized was made from lead carbonate, beautiful and deadly. The red lip color came from cinnabar mercury sulfide, which accumulated in tissues and caused tremors and madness with repeated use. Understanding beauty meant understanding poison. Perfecting your appearance meant accepting that you were essentially applying controlled doses of toxic substances to your skin. Cleopatra would later write about cosmetics and women's medicine, producing texts that circulated under her name in the ancient world and that influenced later medical writers. Even though scholars debate how much she actually wrote verses, how much was attributed to her by later authors seeking to claim royal authority for their formulas, but the core insight that beauty and poison shared chemistry, that the same knowledge that could kill could also enhance and preserve. This understanding would shape her approach to both personal appearance and political survival. When Cleopatra was 14 years old, something happened that would profoundly influence her understanding of power and its costs. Her older sister, Bones IVTH, seized the throne during their father's absence in Rome, where Ptolemy XII had fled to bribe senators for military support. Bones ruled Egypt for 3 years, demonstrating competence that exceeded her father's weak leadership. She married twice, murdering her first husband within days when he proved inadequate. She maintained order in Alexandria. She managed the economy effectively. By all objective measures, she was a better ruler than Ptolemy XII. But when Ptolemy XII returned with Roman military support purchased through massive bribes, he had Brennus executed immediately. Cleopatra watched as her sister, who had been queen and who had ruled well, was killed by their father simply because she had dared to claim power that he considered his by right. The lesson was brutal and unmistakable. Competence meant nothing. Justice meant nothing. Only force mattered. Only the person who controlled military power could rule, regardless of merit or legitimacy or family bonds. Cleopatra was present at court when Brennus died, 14 years old, watching her sister executed, learning that power came from Rome and that survival meant making Romans choose to protect you rather than destroy you. This experience would shape everything she did afterward. She would never trust family. She would never believe that being right or just or competent provided safety. She would understand that her only protection was making herself so valuable to powerful men that killing her seemed less advantageous than keeping her alive. When Cleopatra was 18 years old, her father died and the throne passed jointly to her and her 10-year-old brother Tommy XIII, who became her husband in the formalic tradition of keeping power within the family. But the marriage was purely ceremonial. Cleopatra had no intention of sharing actual power with a child or with his advisors who wanted to control Egypt through him. She ruled alone for 3 years, making decisions, meeting with councils, conducting diplomacy, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded most of her Ptolemaic predecessors. Then her brother's advisors, led by a cunning eunuch named Pythanes and an ambitious general named Achilles, staged a coup. They convinced the young Tommy XIII that he should rule without his older sister. They turned the royal guard and the army against Cleopatra. She was forced to flee Alexandria with a small group of loyal followers, escaping to Syria, where she began raising an army to fight for her kingdom. For a year, Egypt was divided between the sibling rulers, both claiming legitimacy, both preparing for civil war that would devastate the countryside and drain the treasury. Into this situation stumbled Julius Caesar, pursuing his defeated rival Pompey after winning the Roman civil war that had torn the Republic apart. Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge, but Tommy XIII's advisors decided to murder him, cutting off his head and presenting it to Caesar as a gift they thought would win his favor. They were spectacularly wrong. Caesar was horrified that a great Roman had been killed by Egyptians, that his former ally and son-in-law had been assassinated by foreign hands, that the dignity of Rome had been violated. He seized control of Alexandria and declared he would arbitrate the succession dispute between Cleopatra and Tommy XIII. This was Cleopatra's opportunity. She needed to reach Caesar before her enemies poisoned his mind against her or had her assassinated. But Alexandria was controlled by her brother's forces. Palace guards had orders to kill her on sight. She needed a way to get past them, to present herself to Caesar in a manner that would immediately establish her as someone extraordinary rather than just another petitioner seeking favors from a Roman conqueror. So Cleopatra staged what would become one of history's most analyzed entrances. The details vary across sources. Plutarch says she had herself rolled up inside a carpet or a large linen sack that was carried into the palace as a delivery to Caesar. When the bundle was unrolled before him, Cleopatra emerged dramatically, presenting herself not humbly but boldly, transforming what could have been a disadvantage into a theatrical advantage that demonstrated creativity, courage, and an understanding that spectacle mattered as much as substance in politics. Other sources describe different methods, but agree on the essential point. She infiltrated past guards who would have killed her, reached Caesar's presence unexpectedly, and immediately captured his attention through sheer audacity. But the carpet entrance, dramatic as it was, only got her into the room. What happened next mattered more. Cleopatra had perhaps 30 seconds before Caesar's guards could intervene, perhaps a minute before Caesar himself decided whether to order her seized or listen to what she had to say. In that brief window, she deployed every weapon she possessed with precision that came from years of preparation and natural gifts that exceeded her training. She spoke to him in flawless Latin rather than requiring a translator, demonstrating education and respect for Roman culture, while also establishing herself as someone who could communicate directly without intermediaries. She immediately acknowledged her desperate position, but framed it as an opportunity rather than weakness, arguing that supporting her would give Caesar control over Egypt's wealth without the complications of trying to govern directly through a hostile child king and his manipulative advisors. She showed no fear, no uncertainty, no hint that she doubted her right to rule or her ability to convince this hardened Roman general that she was worth preserving. She was 21 years old. Caesar was 52, a hardened military commander who had seen everything human nature could produce in decades of warfare and political maneuvering. He had negotiated with kings and senators and generals. He had commanded armies through impossible campaigns. He had survived assassination attempts and political plots. Yet by all accounts, Cleopatra fascinated him from that first encounter. Not just because she was physically attractive, though ancient sources agree she was beautiful, but because she was intellectually stimulating, because conversation with her was enjoyable rather than merely transactional, because she combined quick wit with broad knowledge, with evident ambition in ways that made her genuinely interesting as a person, rather than simply as a political asset or potential intimate partner. Caesar decided to support Cleopatra against her brother. This decision led to the Alexandrian War, a brutal urban conflict that trapped Caesar in the palace quarter with only a few thousand troops against Tammy the 13th's much larger army. Fighting raged through Alexandria's streets for months. Parts of the city burned, including sections near the famous library, though debates continue about exactly what was destroyed. Caesar nearly died multiple times. Once reportedly swimming through the harbor under arrow fire, holding documents above his head to keep them dry while enemy archers targeted him. But eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived. Tommy the 13th's forces collapsed. The boy king himself drowned while fleeing across the Nile, weighed down by golden armor, dying at 14 in the same river that had fed Egypt since before the pyramids were built. Cleopatra was installed as sole ruler of Egypt with another younger brother, Tommy I 14th, as her nominal co-ruler and husband. But this time, there was no question who actually controlled the throne. Egypt was Cleopatra's, and Caesar, instead of immediately returning to Rome to consolidate his victory in the civil war, stayed in Alexandria for months, living in the palace, enjoying Cleopatra's company, sailing up the Nile with her on a luxurious barge to display their alliance to Egyptian subjects who needed to understand that their queen had the backing of Rome's most powerful man. Fathering a child she would name Caesarion, Little Caesar, whose parentage was obvious to everyone, even though Caesar never formally acknowledged him as his son. What exactly was happening between Caesar and Cleopatra during those months? Ancient sources describe a relationship that combined genuine affection with political calculation, intimate partnership with strategic alliance. They spent hours in conversation, discussing history and philosophy and poetry, debating ideas and sharing knowledge. They planned Egypt's administration and trade policies, determining how to maximize agricultural production and manage the grain supply that fed Rome. They hosted banquets where Greek and Roman aristocrats mingled uneasily, trying to understand the implications of this unprecedented partnership between Rome's dictator and Egypt's queen. And according to sources, both Roman and Egyptian, they became intimate partners in the fullest sense, creating a bond that was simultaneously personal and political, emotional and practical, a relationship that could not be easily categorized as either love or alliance, because it was genuinely both. The scandal back in Rome was immediate and severe. Caesar was married to Calpurnia, a respectable Roman matron who had done nothing to deserve public humiliation. He was expected to return and govern, to consolidate his victory, to rebuild institutions destroyed by civil war. Instead, he lingered in Egypt with a foreign queen young enough to be his daughter, apparently indifferent to what Romans thought about this blatant display of inappropriate attachment. When Caesar finally returned to Rome in 46 years before Christ, Cleopatra followed him within months, establishing herself in one of his villas across the Tiber with a full Egyptian household, including priests, servants, scholars, and guards. She lived there for 2 years, making no secret of their relationship, attending public events, meeting with Roman aristocrats and intellectuals, fascinating some while horrifying others with what they saw as Oriental luxury and inappropriate influence over the man who held absolute power in Rome. Romans who visited Cleopatra's villa described it with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. The architecture was adapted to include Egyptian elements, creating a hybrid space that was neither fully Roman nor fully Egyptian, but something new and unsettling. She maintained Egyptian religious practices with shrines to Isis and other deities that made Romans uncomfortable because Egyptian worship involved practices they found alien and disturbing. She dressed sometimes in Roman style, but often in Egyptian royal regalia, emphasizing her foreignness rather than attempting to blend in or conform to Roman expectations. She spoke Latin perfectly, but also conducted conversations in Greek and Egyptian, surrounding herself with multilingual scholars and creating an intellectual salon that attracted Rome's curious minds, while also disturbing those who thought foreign queens should not hold court in the capital. Then on the Ides of March in 44 years before Christ, senators assassinated Caesar in the theater of Pompey, stabbing him 23 times in what they claimed was tyrannicide necessary to save the Republic from permanent dictatorship. Cleopatra fled Rome immediately, within days of the assassination, understanding that without Caesar's protection, she was in mortal danger from his enemies and possibly from the assassins themselves, who might see her as a symbol that needed elimination. She returned to Alexandria, and within months, her brother husband, Ptolemy XIV, died suddenly under mysterious circumstances, almost certainly poisoned on her orders, removed because even a ceremonial co-ruler represented a theoretical threat to her absolute control. At 25 years old, Cleopatra had secured sole authority over Egypt through a combination of intelligence, audacity, theatrical self-presentation, intimate partnership with Rome's most powerful man, and casual murder of a family member who represented even a theoretical challenge to her power. And now fully in control, she would rule for the next 14 years in ways that created legends even during her lifetime. In those underground chambers beneath the Alexandrian palace, away from public view and protected by layers of secrecy enforced through religious oaths and threat of execution, Cleopatra conducted experiments that went far beyond conventional medical research. The ritual that the Greek physician Olympos witnessed was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic program that Cleopatra maintained for years, working with Egyptian priests and Greek physicians to explore boundaries of human experience that most rulers would never dare to approach. The condemned criminal on the stone altar had been prepared according to specific protocols that Cleopatra had developed through previous experiments. He was washed with water from the Nile mixed with natron salts, the same substance used in mummification, creating symbolic connections to death and rebirth that were not accidental. Everything Cleopatra did carried layers of meaning, references to Egyptian religious tradition, connections to mythology, symbolic resonances that participants might not consciously recognize, but that created psychological effects nonetheless. The man was anointed with oils, myrrh, frankincense. Something else Olympos could not identify that made his skin tingle where drops accidentally touched his hand, suggesting substances that affected the nervous system even through topical application. Then Cleopatra began the invocations, speaking in ancient Egyptian, the language of temple rituals rather than the common demonic Egyptian that most people spoke using formula so archaic that even the priests struggled to translate some phrases. Her voice changed as she spoke, becoming deeper, more resonant, as though something larger spoke through her, or as though she had trained herself to produce vocal effects that enhanced the ritual's psychological impact. The priests responded with chants that had been old when the pyramids were new. Formula preserved in temple archives and taught only to initiates sworn to secrecy about what they witnessed and performed. The chamber itself was designed to enhance psychological effects. Not large, perhaps 20 ft across, with walls pressing close and ceiling low enough that tall men had to duck. The lamplight created more shadow than illumination, making it difficult to see clearly beyond a few feet, forcing participants to focus on the central altar and on Cleopatra herself. The air grew thick with incense smoke and something else, something like electricity before a thunderstorm, a tension that made skin prickle and breathing difficult. Olympos found his hand shaking so hard he could barely write, his rational training as a physician seeming inadequate against the overwhelming atmospheric pressure of this space designed to overwhelm normal psychological defenses. Cleopatra approached the altar, carrying a small clay jar unremarkable in appearance, containing a substance she had prepared herself through processes she had refined over years of experimentation. She explained its effects in clinical Greek, speaking to the physicians present as though conducting a routine demonstration rather than something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This was a compound derived from 3 different plant sources mixed in precise ratios she had determined through previous experiments on other condemned criminals whose deaths had provided the data she needed. It would produce a state of heightened sensitivity combined with paralysis, a condition where the subject would be fully conscious and fully aware, able to feel everything, but unable to move or speak. The effect would last approximately 2 hours based on the dose she had calculated for this subject's body weight. Afterward, if the dose was correct, The subject would recover with no permanent physical damage, though the psychological effects were unpredictable and probably severe. She offered the jar to the condemned man. He had been given a choice, she explained matter-of-factly, as though this made what was about to happen somehow ethical. Drink this and participate in research that would advance medical knowledge and potentially save lives in the future. Or die by crucifixion in the public square, where his suffering would last for days and serve no purpose beyond entertainment for crowds and punishment for his crimes. He had chosen this option supposedly voluntarily, though what meaningful choice existed between two forms of death remained a question that Olympos wanted to ask, but knew better than to voice aloud. He did not contradict Cleopatra in her own palace, in her own ritual space, when she was speaking as Isis incarnate, rather than as merely a mortal queen, subject to normal moral constraints. The man drank. The substance tasted bitter according to the grimace that crossed his face, but he consumed it all under Cleopatra's watchful eyes. Within minutes, perhaps 5 or 6, by Olympus's estimation, though time felt distorted in that chamber, the compound began working. The man's muscles went rigid in stages, starting with his extremities and moving inward toward his core. His breathing became shallow and rapid, then slower and deeper as the paralysis affected his respiratory muscles. His eyes widened with what might have been fear, or might have been the physiological response to whatever substances were coursing through his blood and binding to receptors in his brain and nerves. Within 10 minutes, he was completely immobile, frozen in a position that looked almost peaceful except for his eyes, which remained open and moving, tracking Cleopatra as she moved around the altar, demonstrating that consciousness remained intact, even as all ability to move or communicate had been stripped away. Cleopatra observed closely, recording his responses with clinical precision that would have been admirable in different circumstances. How long until the paralysis became complete? What muscle groups were affected first and in what sequence? Whether consciousness remained fully intact or became clouded? She asked him questions he could not answer, documenting that he heard and understood by observing his eye movements and pupil dilation, establishing that she had succeeded in creating a state where awareness remained, but all ability to respond was eliminated. Then she began the second phase of the experiment, the phase that Olympos would struggle to write about later, that would haunt him for decades, that convinced him that Cleopatra had gone beyond medical research into territory that violated every principle of healing and humanity that physicians swore to uphold. She began testing the man's responses to various stimuli, systematically exploring what happened when sensation could not be processed through normal physical reactions or vocalizations. Pain came first, sharp instruments applied to skin in escalating intensities. How much could he feel when movement was impossible? How did his body respond when pain could not be escaped through reflex withdrawal? What happened to heart rate and breathing patterns when suffering could not be expressed through crying or screaming? Cleopatra measured pulse at his neck, counted respirations, observed pupil dilation and sweat production, and other involuntary responses that revealed the intensity of his experience even when he could not communicate it directly. Then other sensations, pleasant ones, oils that created warmth spreading across skin, substances that stimulated nerve endings in ways that under normal circumstances would produce pleasure, gentle touches alternating with sharp pain. Combinations of contradictory stimuli applied simultaneously to different parts of the body, creating conflicts where pain and pleasure mixed together until they became indistinguishable. Cleopatra was systematically mapping human responses, determining what happened when normal feedback mechanisms were disrupted, when the ability to react physically was removed, when sensation became overwhelming but could not be processed through normal channels of movement or vocalization or escape. The three witnesses watched in horrified fascination, unable to look away even as they understood they were observing something that should not be observed, that they were being transformed from innocent physicians and priests into accomplices in whatever this was. They were being bound through shared knowledge, through participating in something that could never be fully described or explained to anyone who had not been present, through the understanding that speaking about this would mean their own deaths, but remaining silent would mean carrying this knowledge alone forever. Cleopatra was creating complicity deliberately, ensuring loyalty not through bribes or threats, but through the terrible intimacy of shared transgression, through knowing they had witnessed something that changed how they understood human experience and their own capacity for observing suffering without intervention. The experiment continued for 6 hours, far longer than Olympus had anticipated when he first arrived. Cleopatra tested 5 different compounds on the condemned man, waiting between doses for previous effects to clear enough that new observations would be interpretable. With each substance, she recorded symptoms meticulously in her own hand, filling papyrus sheets with observations written in Greek and Egyptian, creating documentation that would later be referenced in medical texts, though never attributed openly to experiments conducted on living human subjects. She asked the man questions when his ability to speak returned between paralyses, cataloging his subjective experiences, documenting how different compounds produce different qualities of sensation or different levels of awareness or different degrees of terror and helplessness. She showed no emotion throughout, no distress, no apparent recognition that she was torturing a human being to death for her curiosity and her pursuit of knowledge. Her face remained calm, focused, intellectually engaged in the same way it might have been engaged during a philosophical debate or a mathematical proof. This was research. This was the pursuit of understanding. That it required a man to suffer for hours before dying was unfortunate but acceptable. A necessary cost of advancing knowledge that would benefit herself and potentially others who might use this information to develop better poisons or better antidotes or better methods of achieving control over human bodies and minds. By dawn, when the first light began penetrating the narrow shafts that brought air to the underground chamber, the condemned man was dead. Cleopatra had learned everything she needed. She had filled multiple scrolls with observations. She had documented compounds that might be useful for medical purposes or for political eliminations or for creating states of helpless vulnerability that could be exploited. She thanked the witnesses and dismissed them with clear instructions that would be reinforced through religious oaths and practical threats. They would speak to no one about what they had witnessed ever. Not to other physicians, not to friends, not to family, certainly not to anyone outside Egypt who might carry Thales back to Rome. The research was protected by royal authority and religious sanction, revealing it would constitute blasphemy against Isis, whose ritual space had been used, and treason against the crown, whose secrets were being protected. Both crimes carried death penalties far worse than what they had just witnessed. Olympus left the chamber as the sun rose over Alexandria, climbing stairs that brought him back to the surface world where ordinary people were beginning their daily routines. Merchants opening shops, workers heading to docks and warehouses, children playing in streets, the normal world continuing as though nothing had changed, as though he had not just spent the night witnessing something that should not exist. And he understood that he had crossed a boundary he could never recross, that he could never return to simple faith in reason and medicine and the fundamental decency of human beings who pursued knowledge, that he would carry this experience alone because speaking about it was impossible and forgetting it was equally impossible. This experiment was only one example of practices that Cleopatra conducted regularly over years of rule. She maintained what amounted to a research program in those underground chambers, working with priests and physicians to explore boundaries of human experience that most people could not imagine, and that those who could imagine would reject as impossible or as Roman propaganda designed to make her seem monstrous. She tested substances on condemned criminals with systematic rigor, documenting effects that contributed to medical knowledge, but that were gathered through methods that violated every ethical principle that physicians claimed to follow. She compiled comprehensive information about poisons, creating what later writers would describe as the most complete toxicology text of the ancient world, even though the methods used to gather that information were deliberately obscured or attributed to less disturbing sources. She learned which substances killed quickly and which slowly, which produced pain and which induced peaceful unconsciousness, which could be detected in food or wine, and which were tasteless and odorless, which had antidotes, and which were inevitably fatal. This knowledge served both medical and political purposes, allowing her to treat poisoning victims but also to eliminate enemies without leaving evidence that would point conclusively to her involvement. He also conducted extensive experiments with cosmetics, testing formulas on palace slaves who had no ability to refuse. If a new mixture caused skin irritation or worse effects, the slaves suffered the consequences, while Cleopatra learned what to avoid. Dozens of slaves bore scars and burns from her experiments, marking their bodies with the cost of her pursuit of beauty formulas that would enhance her appearance and give her advantages in courts where physical attractiveness mattered. Some lost their sight when eye makeup formulas proved too corrosive, the lead and mercury compounds damaging delicate tissues beyond repair. Some died when absorbed compounds proved more toxic than anticipated, killing them slowly as poisons accumulated in their organs. Their suffering was not intentional cruelty for its own sake, but rather acceptable costs in Cleopatra's pursuit of formulas that would benefit her personally and that could be shared with allies to demonstrate favor and create obligations. Among the texts attributed to Cleopatra that circulated in the ancient world, several dealt with women's medicine and cosmetics. Later medical writers, including Galen and Dioscorides, referenced these formulas, suggesting that some of Cleopatra's research had practical value that extended beyond her own use. Recipes for skin whitening creams using lead compounds carefully balanced to avoid obvious poisoning. Eye makeup formulas that enhanced appearance while minimizing the blindness that careless application could cause. Hair treatments that preserved color and prevented premature gray. Perfumes created through distillation processes that concentrated scents from flowers and resins and animal secretions. One formula attributed to Cleopatra involved a mixture called Mandesian perfume created from myrrh, cinnamon, and other expensive ingredients combined through processes that required weeks of preparation. This perfume became famous in the ancient world, associated with Cleopatra's seductive power, supposedly worn during her meetings with Caesar and Antony. Modern attempts to recreate it based on ancient descriptions have produced intensely complex scents that combine floral, spicy, and musky notes in ways that are simultaneously attractive and slightly unsettling, beautiful, but with undertones of something darker. But Cleopatra's experiments in those underground chambers involved more than toxicology and cosmetics. She was also exploring the intersection of religious ritual, physical sensation, and psychological manipulation, discovering how these elements could be combined to produce effects that transcended their individual components. The scene Olympos witnessed with the paralyzed, condemned man was not simply a medical experiment. It was a demonstration for the two Egyptian priests, showing them what Cleopatra had learned about inducing altered states, about the power of witnessing transgression, about how religious context could transform acts that would otherwise seem monstrous into something that participants experienced as sacred, or at least as justified by purposes larger than individual suffering. Cleopatra understood something that most rulers of her time did not consciously recognize. Shared transgression creates bonds stronger than normal loyalty. People who witness forbidden acts together become connected through their mutual complicity, through the understanding that revealing what happened would implicate themselves as much as it would damage the person who ordered the acts. Religious ritual provides context that can reframe experiences, making them seem spiritually significant rather than merely physical or criminal. Combining these elements, creating situations where transgression occurs within religious frameworks and is witnessed by carefully selected participants, produces psychological effects that ensure loyalty and silence far more effectively than simple threats or bribes. She applied this understanding to her cultivation of loyalty among priests and advisors and intimate associates. She would invite select individuals to witness ceremonies in those underground chambers, rituals that mixed traditional Egyptian religious practices with innovations that pushed boundaries and violated conventional norms. These witnesses would find themselves participating in something that felt both sacred and transgressive, that invoked ancient tradition while also challenging it, that created experiences they could not fully interpret or explain. Afterward, they were bound to Cleopatra, not just through fear of punishment for revealing secrets, but through the peculiar intimacy that comes from sharing experiences that cannot be communicated to outsiders without losing something essential in the patra. Translation: some of these ceremonies involved the Isis rituals that so disturbed Roman sources. The myths of Isis included her resurrection of Osiris through magic and the divine conception of Horus, achieved through means that ancient sources described euphemistically, but that involved Isis transforming herself into a bird and hovering over Osiris's reassembled body. Temple rituals reenacted these moments with elaborate symbolism, using movements and chants and sacred objects that represented the goddess's actions without literally replicating them. Cleopatra, presenting herself as Isis incarnate, conducted versions of these rituals that went beyond traditional practice. Exactly what happened remains disputed because sources disagree and because participants were bound to secrecy by religious oaths that they took seriously even when political loyalty might have wavered. Egyptian sources that survived suggest solemn religious observance conducted according to ancient traditions, with Cleopatra serving as the vessel through which Isis's presence manifested. Roman sources written after Cleopatra's death hint at inappropriate acts disguised as ceremony, at boundaries deliberately blurred between sacred and sensual. At Cleopatra, using religious authority to justify behaviors that would otherwise have scandalized even her own court. Plutarch and Cassius Dio both reference these ceremonies with language that suggests impropriety without describing details explicitly, following a Roman rhetorical convention of alluding to things considered too shocking or too foreign to write about directly. They use phrases like ceremonies that cannot be spoken about and rituals that Romans would consider blasphemous and performances that mixed worship with other acts, leaving readers to imagine what might have occurred while also creating the impression that something genuinely disturbing happened in those temple spaces where Cleopatra performed as the living goddess. The truth probably falls between these extremes, with Cleopatra conducting traditional rituals with amplifications and theatrical innovations that enhanced their psychological impact while also serving political purposes. She merged authentic Egyptian temple practices, which were already alien and unsettling to Roman observers, with additions that made them even more powerful as tools for binding participants through shared experience of something extraordinary. She invited select witnesses whose attendance was politically significant, creating networks of priests and aristocrats and foreign dignitaries who had seen things that marked them as insiders to mysteries that outsiders could never fully understand. And she created experiences that participants struggled to interpret, that felt simultaneously spiritual and physical, that bonded them to her through a combination of religious awe and more complex emotions that they could not easily articulate. This approach reached its fullest expression in her relationship with Mark Antony, a relationship that scandalized Rome and that provides the most detailed evidence we have about Cleopatra's methods of combining theater, religion, intimacy, and political calculation into something that transcended simple categories of alliance or romance or seduction. When Cleopatra met Mark Antony in 41 years before Christ in the city of Tarsus on the coast of modern Turkey, 3 years after Caesar's assassination and the chaos of civil wars that followed, she was 28 years old and had been ruling Egypt independently for 7 years. Antony was 42, a powerful Roman general who had emerged as one of 3 men controlling the Roman world after defeating Caesar's assassins. He controlled the eastern Mediterranean and needed Egyptian wealth to finance his planned campaign against Sparta, Rome's great rival in the east. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection against rivals and needed his recognition of her son Caesarion as Caesar's legitimate heir, which would give the boy claims to both Egypt and potentially to Rome itself. Meeting was supposed to be a political negotiation between a Roman master summoning a client queen to explain herself and demonstrate loyalty. Antony had sent messages making this power dynamic clear. Cleopatra was expected to come to Tarsus to present herself humbly to offer explanations for why Egypt had not provided more support during recent civil wars, to beg for continued Roman protection. This was the conventional relationship between Rome and its client kingdoms. Roman power was absolute. Client rulers existed at Roman sufferance, showing appropriate difference was not just expected, but required for survival. Cleopatra understood this dynamic perfectly. She also understood that accepting it would place her permanently in a subordinate position, would make her just another client ruler among many, would limit her ability to pursue Egypt's interests or to protect her own position. So she rejected the conventional approach entirely. Instead of going to Tarsus quickly and presenting herself humbly, she staged an entrance so elaborate and so overwhelming that it transformed the entire relationship before a single word was spoken. She came by water, sailing up the river Cydnus toward Tarsus in a barge that became legendary even before she arrived. Ancient sources described this vessel with language that suggests they struggled to find adequate words for its extravagance. The hull was covered in gold leaf that caught sunlight and made the barge seem to glow as it approached. The sails were purple silk, the color reserved for royalty, and they were not merely purple, but perfumed. Cleopatra had ordered them soaked in expensive scents so that their fragrance carried for miles downstream, announcing her approach long before the barge came into view. The scent was Menesian perfume, the formula she had developed herself, a complex mixture that combined floral sweetness with spicy warmth, with musky undertones that created an olfactory experience as overwhelming as the visual spectacle. Silver oars beat in time to music played by an orchestra assembled on deck. Flutes and lyres and drums and instruments Antony had never seen, producing sounds that mixed Greek and Egyptian and Eastern musical traditions into something hypnotic and strange. The oarsmen themselves were dressed in elaborate costumes, rowing in perfect synchronization while the music swelled and receded, creating rhythms that felt almost narcotic in their effect on listeners waiting on shore. The deck was dressed like a temple to Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, creating religious context for what was ostensibly a political meeting. Flowering plants in golden pots, draperies of silk and linen blowing in the breeze, incense burning in censers, adding more scent to the already overwhelming perfume from the sails. The visual effect was simultaneously beautiful and unsettling, too perfect, too elaborate, obviously a performance, but one executed with such skill that it transcended obvious artifice and became something genuinely impressive. And at the center of this floating stage, under a canopy woven with gold thread that created a throne-like space, reclined Cleopatra herself, dressed not as an Egyptian queen, but as Aphrodite incarnate, wearing clothing designed to display rather than conceal. Her body positioned deliberately to suggest divine beauty made manifest. Her face was painted with the cosmetics she had perfected through years of experimentation, making her skin luminous, her eyes enormous and hypnotic, her lips the exact shade of red that ancient sources describe as irresistible. Her hair was styled in elaborate curls held with golden pins, each pin shaped like a cupid or a dove, symbols of the goddess she was representing. Around her stood attendants dressed as cupids and nymphs, figures from Greek mythology made flesh. According to Roman sources, including Plutarch, who had access to eyewitness accounts, many of these attendants were barely clothed or entirely naked, their skin painted with gold dust and oiled so that they gleamed in the sunlight. Whether this detail is literally accurate or represents Roman exaggeration, designed to make the scene seem more shocking remains debated, but the core point is clear. Cleopatra had created a living tableau that merged religious imagery with erotic suggestion with political theater, overwhelming multiple senses simultaneously and creating an experience that observers would remember and discuss for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact on Antony was exactly what Cleopatra had calculated. He had summoned her to Tarsus, expecting a subordinate queen who would beg for his favor, who would present herself humbly and acknowledge his superior position. Instead, he encountered a woman who presented herself as a goddess, who approached him not as a supplicant, but as an equal or even a superior, whose arrival was designed to overwhelm his senses and put him immediately on the defensive psychologically. By the time Cleopatra actually spoke with Antony, by the time they moved beyond the theatrical performance to substantive political discussion, she'd already won the critical first engagement through pure spectacle. She had demonstrated that she possessed resources, creativity, and boldness that exceeded anything had encountered in his dealings with other client rulers. She had established that she would not be easily intimidated or manipulated, that she was someone who understood theater and psychology and the importance of first impressions in negotiations. She had made herself interesting in ways that went beyond simple political utility, transforming what should have been a routine meeting between master and client into something memorable and intriguing. What happened between Cleopatra and Antony over the following days and weeks transformed a political negotiation into something far more complex that would ultimately reshape the Mediterranean world. Ancient sources describe banquets of extraordinary extravagance where Cleopatra deployed Egyptian wealth not just to impress, but to seduce psychologically, to create dependence on pleasures that only she could provide. Plutarch describes how Cleopatra would change the decor and theme of her banquets nightly, keeping Antony constantly surprised, preventing him from adapting to any particular level of luxury or any specific form of entertainment. Each night was different. Each night exceeded the last in some dimension, even if not in simple cost or quantity. One night, the banquet would emphasize intellectual stimulation, with philosophers from Alexandria debating questions of ethics and metaphysics, with poets reciting verses in Greek and Egyptian, with demonstrations of astronomical knowledge, using instruments that predicted planetary movements and eclipse times. Antony, educated but not deeply intellectual by Roman standards, found these performances fascinating, enjoyed feeling like he was participating in high culture rather than simply consuming food and wine. Cleopatra positioned herself as his guide through these intellectual pleasures, explaining references he did not catch, translating poetry between languages, making him feel simultaneously impressed and slightly inadequate in ways that created psychological dependence. Another night would emphasize sensory pleasures, with foods so exotic that Antony had never encountered them, with wines from regions he had never heard of, with perfumes and incense that created overwhelming olfactory experiences, with music that combined instruments and rhythms from across the known world. The excess was deliberate and strategic. Cleopatra wanted Antony to associate her presence with pleasures that were unavailable anywhere else, to make returning to Rome's comparative austerity seem unbearable, to bind him through appetite in ways that transcended simple physical attraction. A third night might emphasize religious mysteries, with Egyptian priests performing ceremonies that combined authentic temple rituals with theatrical innovations designed for Roman audiences who found Egyptian religion simultaneously fascinating and disturbing. These performances often involve costumes and movements and chanting that Romans interpreted as having erotic undertones, even when Egyptian participants insisted everything was purely spiritual. Cleopatra's ability to navigate between these interpretations, to present herself as both pious Egyptian queen performing sacred duties and as sophisticated cosmopolitan who understood how Romans perceived these rituals, allowed her to create experiences that were genuinely ambiguous, that could be interpreted multiple ways, depending on the observer's expectations and assumptions. Ancient sources hint at something more happening during these banquets beyond simple entertainment. Plutarch describes a society that Cleopatra and Antony formed called the Inimitable Livers, a kind of exclusive club dedicated to pursuing pleasures with no restraint or limit, beyond imagination and endurance. Members gathered nightly for entertainments that lasted until dawn, featuring levels of excess that shocked even Romans who were accustomed to aristocratic extravagance. But the sources also suggest that this excess went beyond conventional bounds, that there were games and contests that pushed boundaries, that Cleopatra and Antony engaged in competitions to see who could devise more extreme experiences or sustain activities longer. Some of these hints focus on intimate competitions. Later sources, including Suetonius, suggest that Cleopatra and Antony engaged in contests to see who could invent new pleasures, treating their relationship partially as a game where innovation and intensity became goals in themselves rather than mere side effects of physical attraction. Whether this is literally true or represents Roman attempts to make sense of a relationship that violated their categories for how men and women should interact remains impossible to determine with certainty. Romans expected men to dominate and women to submit in intimate matters. A relationship where the female partner might be equal or even dominant, where she might be the one proposing activities or setting terms, violated their assumptions so completely that they struggled to describe it accurately. What we can say with confidence is that Cleopatra's relationship with Antony became a scandal that Antony's rivals in Rome exploited mercilessly. Octavian, who would become Augustus, waged a propaganda campaign that portrayed Antony as enslaved by Cleopatra's sexuality, as corrupted by Eastern decadence, as having abandoned Roman values for Egyptian excess. Octavian commissioned poets to write verses describing Cleopatra as a drunken who had destroyed Antony's judgment. He spread stories about orgies and drug use and religious ceremonies that mixed pagan worship with inappropriate acts. He claimed Cleopatra was a witch who had used magic and potions to enslave Antony's will, making him a puppet who obeyed her commands and who would betray Rome itself at her direction. Some of this propaganda was certainly false or exaggerated, but Cleopatra's own behavior gave it foundation that made it believable to Roman audiences. Already predisposed to think the worst of a foreign queen who had seduced two of their most powerful men, she deliberately cultivated a reputation for excess. She presented herself publicly in ways that emphasized her femininity and her power simultaneously, refusing to conform to Roman expectations about proper behavior for women. She conducted religious ceremonies that Romans found disturbing even when they were performed according to authentic Egyptian traditions. And she lived with Antony and Alexandria for years in a relationship that produced 3 children, and that Romans refused to recognize as legitimate marriage, even though Antony formally married Cleopatra in a ceremony that granted her extraordinary honors and titles. One particular story from this period became famous as the ultimate symbol of Cleopatra's excess and her corrupting influence on Antony. During a banquet where Antony was boasting about Roman entertainments and the lavishness of his own celebrations, Cleopatra smiled and made a wager. She bet that she could host a single dinner that cost more than all of Antony's entertainments combined. An absurd claim that Antony accepted because he was curious how she would try to win such an impossible bet. The next evening, Cleopatra hosted what appeared to be a relatively simple meal by the standards they had established. Food was excellent but not extraordinary. The wine was fine but not the most expensive vintages. Antony was confused, wondering if Cleopatra had forgotten the wager or was planning some surprise for later. Then came the final course. Cleopatra called for a cup of vinegar, the sharp wine vinegar that Romans used for cooking and cleaning. Then she removed one of her pearl earrings. This was not any pearl, but supposedly one of the 2 largest and most valuable pearls in the world. A treasure that had been part of Tamaic royal jewelry for generations, worth more than entire provinces, according to ancient sources that were prone to exaggeration, but that reflected genuine recognition of extraordinary value. Cleopatra dropped the pearl into the vinegar. According to Pliny's Natural History, the most detailed ancient account, the pearl began dissolving. Modern chemists point out that pearls do not actually dissolve quickly in vinegar. That the chemistry Ply describes does not work the way he claims. That this detail is probably either misunderstood or deliberately fictionalized. But what matters is not whether the chemistry was accurate, but what Cleopatra did next. She drank the mixture, consuming the dissolved pearl and the vinegar, ingesting wealth casually, destroying something of immense value just to make a point, to win a wager, to demonstrate that Egyptian resources were so vast that treasures could be consumed rather than merely displayed. The gesture was simultaneously absurd and profound. It was wasteful beyond any reasonable standard. It violated every normal calculation about value and preservation and responsible stewardship. But it also demonstrated something important about how Cleopatra understood power and display. She could afford to destroy treasures because she had access to such immense wealth that individual objects, no matter how valuable, were ultimately replaceable or at least expendable. She operated by different rules than other people. Rules where normal constraints about resource conservation did not apply because Egyptian wealth was effectively unlimited from the perspective of any individual consumption decision. Whether the story is literally true in all details matters less than its symbolic truth and its psychological impact. Cleopatra created a legend about herself, established a reputation for excess that made her seem both dangerous and irresistible simultaneously. She showed Antony that partnering with her meant access to experiences and resources that exceeded anything he could obtain elsewhere. and she demonstrated a willingness to violate boundaries and ignore conventional constraints that matched Antony's own impulsive nature and his tendency to pursue immediate pleasures rather than long-term strategic calculations. Antony abandoned his military plans and followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria. He would remain in her orbit for the next decade, returning periodically to Rome when political necessity demanded, but always drawn back to Egypt and to Cleopatra. Their relationship produced 3 children, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born in 40 years before Christ, named after the sun and moon in a symbolic gesture that implied they would rule the world together. Another son named Ptolemy Philadelphia, born 3 years later, given a name that connected him to the great Ptolemaic kings who had made Alexandria the center of Hellenistic civilization. Antony formally married Cleopatra in a ceremony that Romans refused to recognize because he was already married to Octavia, Octavian's sister, a marriage that had been arranged precisely to create family bonds between the 2 most powerful men in Rome, by marrying Cleopatra while still married to Octavia. By recognizing their children as legitimate heirs, by granting Cleopatra and her children territories and titles that belonged to Rome, Antony was essentially declaring independence from Roman constraints and establishing Egypt and the East as a separate power center that would rival Rome itself. But what exactly happened between Cleopatra and Antony during those years in Alexandria, beyond the public scandals and the political calculations? Ancient sources describe the inimitable Livers Club in language that emphasizes excess and novelty, but that also hints at something darker, at practices that went beyond conventional aristocratic entertainment into territory that even wealthy Romans found disturbing. Plutarch describes how members would gather nightly in chambers of Cleopatra's palace for banquets and entertainments that lasted until dawn, featuring levels of consumption and behavior that seemed to have no limits beyond physical endurance and imagination. Some accounts suggest they would disguise themselves and wander Alexandria at night, playing pranks on ordinary citizens who did not recognize the queen and Rome's most powerful general, walking among them dressed as common people. These expeditions sometimes turned cruel, according to sources, with property destroyed and people humiliated for the amusement of Cleopatra and Antony and their companions. Whether these stories are accurate or represent later Roman propaganda designed to make them seem irresponsible and unfit for power remains debated, but the pattern is consistent across sources. Their relationship was characterized by constant escalation, by the need for novelty and extremity, by treating normal boundaries as challenges to be overcome rather than as limits to be respected. Later Roman sources, including Suetonius, hint at intimate contests between Cleopatra and Antony, suggestions that they competed to devise new experiences or to sustain activities longer, that they treated their relationship partially as a game where innovation and endurance became measures of dominance or at least of equality. These hints are vague, written in language that implies rather than states directly, following conventions about not describing intimate matters explicitly, while still conveying that something notable and probably shocking was happening. Whether Cleopatra and Antony actually engaged in such competitions, or whether Roman writers simply could not understand a relationship between equals and therefore interpreted it through the only framework that made sense to them. The framework of competition and contest remains impossible to determine conclusively. What seems clear is that their relationship violated Roman expectations in multiple ways simultaneously. It was too equal, with Cleopatra apparently holding as much power as Antony rather than submitting to his authority. It was too public, conducted openly in Alexandria rather than hidden behind proper Roman decorum. It was too political, mixing intimate partnership with strategic alliance in ways that made it unclear where personal affection ended and calculated pursuit of power began. And it lasted too long, continuing for a decade while producing children and while fundamentally reshaping the balance of power in the Mediterranean world. This relationship had consequences that extended far beyond Antony and Cleopatra themselves. It created the conditions for civil war between Antony and Octavian, a war that would determine whether Rome remained unified under single leadership or split into eastern and western halves. It gave Octavian the propaganda material he needed to portray Antony as a traitor corrupted by foreign influence, making the war seem like a righteous conflict to save Rome rather than a power struggle between ambitious men. And it ensured that when Cleopatra eventually lost, she would be remembered not for her intelligence or her political skill, but for her alleged sexual corruption and her corrupting influence on Roman men who should have known better. The propaganda war that Octavian waged before the Battle of Actium in 31 years before Christ was remarkably sophisticated and remarkably successful. He could not simply declare war against Antony, who remained a Roman citizen and who still had many supporters in Rome and throughout the empire. Instead, Octavian declared war against Cleopatra, framing the conflict as Rome defending itself against a foreign threat rather than as Romans fighting each other in yet another civil war. This reframing was crucial for maintaining political legitimacy and for rallying support from Romans who were exhausted by decades of civil conflict. Octavian commissioned poets to write verses describing Cleopatra in language that combined sexual slander with xenophobic fear. Horace called her the mad queen plotting destruction for Rome drunk with sweet fortune, language that implied both mental instability and dangerous ambition. Proper's described her as the queen of incestuous Egypt, invoking Roman disgust at atomic sibling marriage practices, while also suggesting that her sexuality itself was corrupted and corrupting. These poems were performed publicly and circulated in written form, creating a drumbeat of propaganda that shaped public opinion long before any actual fighting began. Octavian also spread stories about Cleopatra's practices that were designed to horrify Romans and to make war against her seem justified as protection against existential threat. He claimed she planned to move Rome's capital to Alexandria to make Romans bow to Egyptian gods, to enslave Roman women, and force them to serve in her court. He said she practiced witchcraft and necromancy, that she consulted with Egyptian magicians who could curse enemies and raise the dead, that she had used potions and spells to enslave Antony's will and make him her puppet. He described her as drunk on power and wine, as hosting orgies where Romans were humiliated, as conducting religious ceremonies that were actually covers for inappropriate acts. Some of this propaganda was certainly invented, but it was effective precisely because it connected to genuine Roman anxieties about Egypt and about powerful women, and about the corruption that Eastern luxury supposedly produced in Romans who were exposed to it. Romans had always viewed Egypt with mixture of fascination and fear. It was ancient beyond anything Rome could claim, possessing knowledge and traditions that predated Roman civilization by thousands of years. It was wealthy beyond Roman imagination, producing gold and grain in quantities that made it the richest kingdom in the known world. It was foreign in ways that were deeply unsettling, worshipping animal-headed gods and practicing mummification and maintaining customs about women and family that Romans found perverse. Cleopatra embodied all of these anxieties. She was Egyptian by rule, though Greek by ancestry. She claimed divine status through identification with Isis. She possessed wealth that allowed her to live in ways Romans could only imagine. She wielded power independently rather than through male relatives. She had intimate relationships with Roman men on her own terms rather than submitting to their authority. Everything about her violated Roman assumptions about proper order, about the natural hierarchy where Romans ruled over foreigners and men ruled over women and civilization, imposed restraint on appetite and luxury. So when Octavian portrayed her as a dangerous witch who threatened Rome's existence, he was not just making up slander. He was articulating fears that many Romans already felt, giving them specific focus and direction, creating a narrative that made war seem necessary and righteous rather than merely convenient for Octavian's own ambitions. The propaganda campaign transformed a complicated political and military situation into a simple story about good versus evil, about Roman virtue versus Eastern corruption, about masculine rationality versus feminine manipulation. This narrative survived Cleopatra's death and became the foundation of how she was remembered. When Octavian became Augustus and established himself as Rome's first emperor, he had complete control over how recent history was recorded and interpreted. The historians who wrote about Cleopatra wrote under Augustus's reign, knowing that describing her sympathetically would mean contradicting the official narrative that justified Augustus' rise to power. The poets who immortalized her in verse wrote with Augustus's patronage, or at least with his implicit approval, meaning their portraits emphasized sexuality and corruption rather than intelligence and political skill. This process of historical distortion was systematic and remarkably successful. By the time Plutarch wrote his biography of Antony more than a century after Cleopatra's death, the basic narrative was fixed. Cleopatra was a seductress who used her body to manipulate powerful men. She was corrupted by luxury and power. She led Antony to ruin through her influence over him. She represented everything dangerous about the East and about powerful women. This portrait was accepted as historical fact for nearly 2,000 years, reinforced through countless retellings in literature, art, theater, and eventually film. Only in relatively recent times have historians begun to question this narrative, to recognize how thoroughly it was shaped by Octavian's propaganda to attempt to recover the more complex reality behind the caricature. Modern scholars point out that Cleopatra ruled Egypt successfully for 21 years, maintaining independence and prosperity during a period when other Hellenistic kingdoms were being absorbed by Rome. They note that she was educated in multiple languages and sciences, that she wrote treatises that influenced later medical practice, that she understood trade and diplomacy and administration well enough to keep Egypt functioning, despite constant Roman pressure. They recognized that Roman sources described her as intelligent and charming, not just beautiful, suggesting that her real power came from her mind as much as from her appearance. They also recognized the double standard inherent in how she was judged. Julius Caesar had numerous affairs and illegitimate children, but he is remembered as a military genius and statesman rather than as someone corrupted by lust. Mark Antony was married multiple times and had relationships with various women before Cleopatra, but his downfall is attributed to her influence rather than to his own choices and weaknesses. Augustus himself, who sanctimoniously condemned Cleopatra as morally corrupt, later exiled his own daughter Julia for adultery while maintaining a private life that was not nearly as virtuous as his public image suggested. Male rulers who used intimate relationships for political purposes were being strategic. Female rulers who did the same thing were being immoral. This double standard extended to how Cleopatra's scientific interests were described. Roman sources that mentioned her experiments with cosmetics and poisons framed these activities as evidence of her corruption, as dabbling in witchcraft or vanity, rather than as legitimate research. But male rulers who investigated poisons or who conducted experiments were praised for their curiosity and their practical interest in protecting themselves from assassination. The knowledge was the same. The methods were similar, but gender transformed how these activities were interpreted and remembered. Modern historians also recognized that many of the specific stories about Cleopatra are either invented or heavily embellished. The competition with professional courtesans that Juvenal describes probably never happened, or at least not in the way he portrays it. The banquets that supposedly featured orgies and degradation were probably conventional aristocratic entertainments that Romans characterized as orgies because they involved Egyptian music and religious performances that seemed alien. The aspect that killed her may be more legend than fact, a detail that was too symbolically perfect to be purely accidental. But even acknowledging all of this, even stripping away obvious propaganda and recognizing historical distortion, something disturbing remains at the core of what we know about Cleopatra. She did conduct experiments on human subjects without their meaningful consent. She did test cosmetics on slaves who bore the physical consequences of failed formulas. She did compile information about poisons through systematic killing of condemned criminals. She did use religious ritual as a tool for political manipulation. She did treat human bodies as experimental materials and human lives as expendable resources in her pursuit of knowledge and power. These practices went beyond what most rulers of her time attempted. Even in an era when human life was valued differently and when absolute rulers operated with few constraints, Cleopatra pushed boundaries deliberately, exploring extremes that others avoided. Treating her underground chambers as laboratories where normal moral rules were suspended in pursuit of understanding that she believed justified any method. Whether this makes her a monster or simply a product of her time, who had more resources and opportunities to pursue her interests than most people, depends on what standards we apply and how we weigh her genuine intellectual achievements against the human costs of obtaining the knowledge that produced those achievements. When the final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 years before Christ, Cleopatra's fleet fought alongside Antony's forces in a naval engagement off the coast of Greece. The battle began in the morning and continued into the afternoon, with neither side gaining clear advantage. Then suddenly, in the middle of the fighting, Cleopatra's ships withdrew. They broke through the battle line and sailed away, heading back toward Egypt with the treasury ships containing the wealth that had financed the war. Why Cleopatra withdrew remains debated. Roman sources claim it was cowardice, that she panicked and fled, abandoning Antony in the middle of battle. Some modern historians argue it was strategic retreat, that she recognized the battle was lost and saved her fleet and treasure while escape was still possible, rather than throwing everything away in futile last stand. Others suggest it may have been prearranged, that Antony knew she would withdraw and was supposed to follow her, but failed to execute the plan properly when his nerve broke or when circumstances changed in ways they had not anticipated. What is certain is that Cleopatra's withdrawal caused Antony's fleet to collapse. His ships fought on for a while, but their morale broke when they saw the Egyptian vessels leaving. Antony himself abandoned his flagship and fled after Cleopatra in a smaller vessel, catching up with her fleet and transferring to her ship. His remaining forces surrendered to Octavian or scattered, and his land army abandoned him when news spread that he had fled the battlefield. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria as defeated rulers whose positions were now hopeless. Octavian controlled the Roman world. His forces would soon arrive in Egypt to complete the conquest. No allies remained who could help. No resources remained that could buy rescue. The end was inevitable. The only questions were timing and specifics. Over the following months, as Octavian slowly advanced on Egypt, consolidating his victory and preparing for final conquest, Antony and Cleopatra's situation became increasingly desperate. Ancient sources described them maintaining appearances, hosting entertainments and ceremonies as though nothing had changed, but this was clearly performance rather than genuine denial. They knew what was coming. They were preparing for death rather than for escape or rescue that was no longer possible. They formed a new society to replace the inimitable livers, calling it the Partners in Death, a name that acknowledged the reality they faced. Members gathered nightly in Cleopatra's palace, but the tone was different now. Elegiac rather than celebratory, focused on preparing themselves psychologically for deaths that were approaching rapidly. Cleopatra began experimenting with methods of suicide, testing different poisons to determine which would be quickest and least painful. This was why she had spent years studying toxicology, why she had documented effects of hundreds of substances on condemned criminals. Now that knowledge would be applied to herself, allowing her to choose death on her own terms rather than submitting to whatever Octavian had planned for her. According to Plutarch, she tested substances on condemned prisoners during these final months, observing their deaths carefully to determine which method she should use on herself when the time came. She apparently concluded that snake venom was preferable to most poisons, producing death that was painful but relatively quick compared to plant-based toxins that might take hours to work. The asp, a venomous snake associated with Egyptian royalty, had symbolic meaning that made it more appropriate for a queen's suicide than simply drinking poison. She would die as an Egyptian goddess, returning to divine realms rather than as a defeated Roman captive succumbing to despair. In August of 30 years before Christ, as Octavian's forces approached Alexandria, the end came quickly. Antony received false reports that Cleopatra had committed suicide. Devastated by the news and seeing no reason to continue living without her, he fell on his sword, stabbing himself in the abdomen. But the wound did not kill him immediately. He lay dying for perhaps an hour before his servants carried him to the mausoleum, where Cleopatra had barricaded herself with her treasure. She had servants pull him up through a window on the building's second level, unwilling to open the sealed doors that protected her from Octavian's soldiers, who were already searching the city for her. Antony died in Cleopatra's arms, bleeding to death from his self-inflicted wound, ending his life as he had lived it, dramatically and impulsively, and without clear plan beyond immediate emotional response. His death left Cleopatra alone to face Octavian, to negotiate if possible, or to control her own end if negotiation failed. Octavian wanted to capture Cleopatra alive, to parade her through Rome in his triumph as the ultimate symbol of his victory over the East. For a queen who had spent her entire life maintaining control and presenting herself on her own terms, this prospect was unbearable. She would not be displayed in chains before Roman crowds. She would not be humiliated as a defeated enemy and a corrupted woman. She would not give Octavian the satisfaction of breaking her will or destroying her dignity. So Cleopatra planned her death as carefully as she had planned every public appearance throughout her life. She negotiated with Octavian through intermediaries, pretending to consider surrender while actually preparing her final performance. She dressed in her royal regalia, the elaborate clothing and jewelry that marked her as queen and as Isis incarnate. She positioned herself on a golden couch surrounded by treasures of Egypt, creating a scene that would be memorable and that would communicate meaning even in death. And then on August 12th, in 30 years before Christ, at age 39, Cleopatra killed herself. The exact method remains disputed across ancient sources. The most famous story says she used an asp, a venomous snake either concealed in a basket of figs or smuggled into her mausoleum by a loyal servant who brought it hidden beneath food or flowers. The snake bite would have been painful, but relatively quick based on her experimental observations, and more importantly, it carried symbolic meaning that transformed suicide into ritual sacrifice. The asp was associated with the goddess Wajet, who protected Egyptian royalty and who was represented by the Ura's cobra worn on pharaonic crowns. By dying from snake venom, Cleopatra was symbolically reuniting with the divine forces that had legitimized her rule. Other sources suggest different methods. Some say she used a poisoned comb or hair pin that she had prepared years earlier, a backup method kept ready for emergency. Some say she drank a mixture of poisons that she had tested and refined through her experiments on condemned criminals, finally using that knowledge on herself to ensure death that was quick and certain. Some say she used an ointment that contained poison absorbed through the skin, applied deliberately to sensitive areas where absorption would be rapid. The variety of accounts suggest that ancient writers themselves were uncertain about the exact mechanism, or that Cleopatra deliberately created mystery around her death as part of her final performance, ensuring that speculation and legend would continue long after her body was cold. What seems clear is that Cleopatra's death was deliberate, planned, and staged with careful attention to symbolism and presentation. She died on her own terms, maintaining control until the very end, transforming what could have been defeat and humiliation into a final assertion of power and dignity. When Octavian's soldiers entered the mausoleum, they found Cleopatra dead on her golden couch, dressed as a queen, with her two most loyal servants also dead beside her. One servant named Iris had died first, possibly from the same poison or snake venom that killed Cleopatra, lying on the floor near the couch. The other servant, Charmian, was still barely alive, adjusting Cleopatra's crown and arranging her clothing to ensure she looked regal even in death. When the Roman soldiers asked what had happened, Charmian replied with words that became legendary and that perfectly captured Cleopatra's final performance. "It is well done, and fitting for a queen descended from so many kings." Then Charmian died as well, following her mistress into death rather than facing Roman interrogation and probable execution. Octavian had Cleopatra's body prepared for burial and placed in a tomb beside Antony, honoring her status, even though he refused to grant any mercy to her children who might challenge his power. He ordered Caesar Ryan, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, hunted down and executed. The boy was 17 years old enough to be a threat, young enough to have no independent power base that could protect him. Octavian could not allow Caesar's possible son to survive as a potential rival for loyalty from those who had supported Caesar or who might challenge Augustus' legitimacy. Cleopatra's 3 children with Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman widow, a woman of remarkable generosity who cared for the children of her husband's foreign lover as though they were her own. The two boys, Alexander Helios and Tommy Philadelphia, disappeared from historical records within a few years, probably dying young from disease or possibly from more sinister causes. Only the daughter Cleopatra Selene survived to adulthood. She was eventually married to Juba II, king of Mauritania in North Africa, becoming a queen herself and living until her 50s. The sole survivor of Cleopatra's children and the only person who carried her bloodline into the future. With Cleopatra dead and her children neutralized, Octavian annexed Egypt not as a regular Roman province, but as his personal possession, making it unique in the empire. The wealth that Cleopatra had used to support Antony and to maintain her own power now flowed directly to Octavian, helping him consolidate control over Rome and finance his transformation from factional leader into Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Tmic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries ended with Cleopatra's death. Egypt would remain under outside control. First Roman, then Byzantine, then Arab, then Ottoman, then British for more than 2,000 years until the 20th century. But Cleopatra's legend survived and grew even as her kingdom disappeared. The propaganda campaign that Octavian had waged against her became the foundation of how she was remembered. Roman poets made her the symbol of female corruption and Eastern decadence. Christian writers used her as an example of the dangers of feminine sexuality and worldly power. Medieval and Renaissance writers reimagined her story as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of lust and ambition. By the time Shakespeare wrote his play Antony and Cleopatra in 166, she had become a literary archetype, the dangerous seductress who destroys men through her sexual power, the foreign queen who threatens civilization through her corrupting influence. Her name became synonymous with female sexuality used as a weapon. Calling someone a Cleopatra meant they were seductive, manipulative, dangerous to men who could not resist their charms. The specific details of her life were forgotten or simplified, but the basic narrative survived. Beautiful foreign queen uses sexuality to control powerful men, leads them to ruin through her influence, represents everything threatening about female power and Eastern corruption, dies dramatically rather than submitting to proper authority. This narrative survived for 2 millennia, reinforced through countless retellings that emphasized the same basic elements, while adding new details or interpretations that reflected the biases and interests of each new generation. Only relatively recently have historians begun seriously questioning this narrative, recognizing how thoroughly it was shaped by propaganda, attempting to recover the more complex reality of who Cleopatra actually was and what she actually did. So what should we make of Cleopatra after examining her life and her practices in detail? Was she primarily a victim of historical bias and propaganda? Or was she genuinely transgressive in ways that justified at least some of the negative judgments Romans made about her? Was she a brilliant ruler who used every tool available to survive in a world hostile to female independence? Or was she someone whose pursuit of power and knowledge carried her into territory that violated fundamental ethical principles regardless of gender or historical context? The honest answer is that Cleopatra was both brilliant and ruthless, intellectually gifted and morally flexible, genuinely interested in knowledge and willing to obtain it through methods that most people would find horrifying. She ruled Egypt successfully for 21 years during a period when other Hellenistic kingdoms were being absorbed by Rome, maintaining independence and prosperity through intelligent diplomacy and strategic use of Egypt's wealth and resources. She was educated in multiple languages and sciences, wrote treatises that influenced later medical practice, understood trade and administration and governance well enough to keep Egypt functioning despite constant Roman pressure. But she also conducted experiments on human subjects without their meaningful consent, testing poisons on condemned criminals and cosmetics on slaves who bore the physical and sometimes fatal consequences of failed formulas. She treated human bodies as experimental materials and human lives as expendable resources in her pursuit of knowledge that benefited herself and potentially others. But that was obtained through methods that violated basic principles about human dignity and bodily autonomy. She eliminated family members who threatened her power, poisoning her brother, husband, and ensuring that rivals disappeared conveniently when they became inconvenient. She used religious ritual as a tool for political manipulation, conducting ceremonies that blurred boundaries between sacred and sensual in ways that bound participants through shared experience of transgression. She cultivated relationships with powerful Roman men through combinations of intellectual companionship and physical attraction and strategic partnership that Romans found threatening because they could not easily categorize them. She lived with extravagance and pushed boundaries deliberately, creating a reputation for excess that served her political purposes, but that also gave enemies ammunition for propaganda campaigns that would shape her historical reputation for millennia. The practices that made Cleopatra legendary were they perverted in the sense of representing moral corruption or deviation from proper norms. That depends entirely on what standards we apply and from what perspective we judge. By conventional Roman standards, yes, she went too far. She violated norms about feminine behavior and religious propriety and proper relationships between rulers and subjects. By the standards of her own Egyptian culture and her position as absolute ruler, probably not. The Tmic dynasty had always lived extravagantly, had always merged Greek and Egyptian religious traditions, had always viewed themselves as above moral limitations that applied to ordinary people. By modern standards, some of what Cleopatra did was clearly unethical, regardless of historical context. Experimenting on human subjects without consent violates fundamental principles that apply across cultures and eras. Using slaves as test subjects for cosmetics that caused suffering and death was cruel, even if it was common practice in the ancient world. Eliminating family members through poison was murder, even when political necessity might have made it strategically justifiable. But we must also recognize that Cleopatra was judged more harshly than male rulers who engaged in similar behaviors. Roman emperors conducted their own poison experiments and eliminated rivals and lived with extravagance, but they were not remembered primarily as corrupted or perverted. The difference was gender and the threat that Cleopatra represented to Roman assumptions about proper order. She was a woman wielding power independently. She was a foreigner who made Romans into her allies rather than submitting to Roman authority. She used tools including intimate relationships and religious performance and theatrical self-presentation that Romans found disturbing because they suggested power could be obtained and maintained through means other than military force and formal political institutions. Understanding Cleopatra requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. She was extraordinarily intelligent and capable. She was ruthless in pursuit of power. She pushed boundaries deliberately. She conducted practices that went beyond acceptable limits by most standards. She was judged by criteria that were applied differently to women than to men. The propaganda against her was systematic and effective and deeply distorting. But some of what she did was genuinely disturbing and would be condemned regardless of gender or historical revisionism. Her legacy is complicated and will remain complicated because she was complicated. She was not simply a seductress, as Roman propaganda claimed. She was not simply a brilliant ruler unfairly maligned by history, as some modern revisionists suggest. She was both and neither, someone whose life and practices defy simple categorization. Someone who fascinates precisely because she pushed boundaries and violated expectations and created legends that have survived for 2,000 years because they touch on fundamental questions about power and gender and the costs. Pursuing knowledge and control without restraint. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most controversial figures fascinating and want to learn more about how powerful women have been judged differently throughout history, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you do not miss future videos about historical figures whose stories have been distorted by propaganda and whose real lives were more complex than simplified legends suggest. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know Cleopatra's story, because I guarantee this account goes deeper and is more nuanced than what they learned from movies and popular culture. Remember her not as the simple seductress of legend, but as the complex reality, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and ruthless ambition who used every tool available to pursue power in a world hostile to female independence. Someone who conducted herself according to her own standards rather than submitting to others' expectations. Someone who created a legend that has outlasted empires even as it distorted the truth about who she actually was. And someone whose practices, whether we call them perverted or simply extreme, went far enough that even sources hostile to her struggled to describe them directly, leaving us with fragments and whispers and debates that will probably never be fully resolved. And remember that the patterns her story exemplifies continue throughout history. The weaponization of sexual slander against powerful women, the double standards in judging male and female rulers, the transformation of complex historical figures into simplified archetypes that serve ideological purposes. Understanding Cleopatra helps us recognize these patterns when they appear, helps us question narratives that seem too convenient, helps us see how power and gender and historical memory interact in ways that shape not just how we understand the past, but how we interpret the present. See you in the next video, where we will continue exploring the dark corners of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about power, propaganda, and how we construct the stories we tell about the past.